Welcome to the IoDSA podcast, where we explore governance in action. My name is Vas, and I'm the Executive of Client Services at the IoDSA. Today, I'm unpacking one of the most difficult realities facing boards and leaders, ethical dilemmas. Joining me on Zoom is Dr. Liezl Groenewald, ethics specialist and CEO of the Ethics Institute. This conversation is really about ethics in practice, going beyond policies and documents and codes of conduct, and getting to the realities of ethics and what it means for directors and boards. Liezl, thanks so much for joining us. I've been really looking forward to this particular discussion around ethics and organizational ethics. I find it super fascinating. So I'm really keen to pick your brain in terms of what directors should really be thinking about when it comes to ethics, what boards should be thinking about, and also stakeholders, what stakeholders should be thinking about in terms of ethics and how they view organizations in terms of their practices. So perhaps we can start from the beginning, Liezl, and kind of define what is ethics, what is organizational ethics, what are those two elements?
Thank you, Vas. Thank you for this kind invitation to be taking part in this podcast. Yeah, that question about what is ethics is a question that has puzzled philosophers for many years. But if we want to bring it to practicality, it's the plain definition would be ethics is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. But it isn't always that simple. Ethics is also the practice of determining what is right and wrong, what is good and bad, what is fair and unfair. And it concerns the values, principles, and standards that guide human behavior and decision-making. So at its core, ethics helps us answer questions such as, what ought I to do? What is the right course of action? How should we treat others? And what responsibilities do we have towards others and society? It's pretty much like do to others like you want others to do to you. But one thing we must remember is that ethics is not merely about complying with laws, rules, and regulations. While the law tells us what we must do, ethics asks what we should do. So there are many situations where a course of action may be legal, but not necessarily ethical. And then from an organizational perspective, ethics can be understood as the application of the values and principles of the organization to decisions, actions, and relationships in a manner that promotes trust, integrity, fairness, responsibility, and respect.
One of the terms that I hear often is ethical dilemmas, and I want to understand that a bit more. It sounds like by being human, we open ourselves up to situations through everyday course of life that could mean we have to make an ethical decision at some point, whether there's some law around it or not. What is an ethical dilemma, and how does that actually play into decision making?
An ethical dilemma, like you said, we are very often faced with it, especially on a board level. So we need to understand what an ethical dilemma is. And this is a situation where people or a person must choose between two or more actions. And importantly, each choice involves a conflict between moral values and principles. It's a situation where there's not necessarily a right and correct answer. So a simple definition would be an ethical dilemma occurs when two moral values clash, such as honesty versus loyalty, or choosing one value means compromising another. So as I've said, there's no perfect solution. Just to give an example, perhaps in everyday life, is one's friend tells you a secret that could harm someone else. So what do? Two choices: keep the secret and stay loyal to your friend. There's the loyalty value. Or tell the truth and protect the other person who will be harmed. That's the honesty value. So typically now you have to decide which of these two values is the most dear to you, and then choose that one. On an organizational level, it becomes very difficult, but the boards must use certain lenses to work through which of the choices they will make. And the lenses, there you have, and I'm not going to go into theory, but you have the rights lens, you have the virtues lens, the fairness and justice lens, and the consequences lens. But that is a discussion for another day.
Liezl, we have a lot of situations at organizational levels where we see these ethical breakdowns. Why do you believe that ethical failures happen or occur in organizations, even if there are these strong policies in place, there's ethical policies? What actually causes that?
Ethical failures occur, because those policies and structures alone does not guarantee ethical behavior. While governance frameworks establish expectations and controls, they cannot replace ethical leadership, sound judgment, and ethical organizational culture. It is about the human aspect. Okay? We cannot just rely on policies and governance. So key reasons, some of them include a gap between the formal systems and the actual behavior. So although there can be excellent policies on paper, employees and leaders might not consistently apply them. Another reason, leadership behavior sends stronger signals than policies. So we know that employees tend to follow what leaders do rather than what the policies say. So if leaders do not follow the policies, your employees might not do the same. And then compliance is mistaken for ethics. And very often people say compliance and ethics are the same thing. They're not. Okay. So governance frameworks often focus on legal and regulatory compliance, but ethical issues frequently arise in situations where the law is silent and human judgment is required. I'll mention two more. Weak accountability leads to ethical failures, and this is where policies are ineffective when violations are not addressed consistently and fairly, regardless of the seniority or influence of the individuals involved. And then a very important one as well is that the speaking up or the whistleblowing mechanisms are ineffective. So even where whistleblowing channels exist, employees, and we see this from research, may fear retaliation or believe that reporting concerns will not lead to meaningful actions.
So, Liezl, what is the board's role in terms of governing ethics and ensuring the right ethical outcomes?
That is a very important question. Thank you for that, Vas. The board plays a pivotal role in shaping the ethical outcomes because they are ultimately responsible for the organization's ethical direction, its culture, as well as its integrity. While management is responsible for implementing ethics programs, the implementation and day-to-day decision-making, the board must provide the oversight and set the expectations and ensure that the ethical considerations are integrated into governance and strategy. And ethics mustn't be seen as a standalone activity that is managed by the ethics officer and overseen by the CEO. Ethics, for it to become part and parcel of the organizational culture, must be embedded in the strategic direction of the organization. So typically what they have to do is setting the ethical tone. We know the fish rots from the top, so if they don't set the tone, chances are that the culture will not necessarily be an ethical or an ethically mature culture. And then importantly is they need to govern ethics. So we see in Principle 2 of King 5 that it states that the governing body is responsible for ensuring that an ethical culture is established. Okay? Amongst others, it also further talks about corporate citizenship. But it tells us that the board can't sit back. They need to actively ensure that ethics is governed, and they have to oversee the ethical culture of the organization through monitoring whether the organization's culture actually supports ethical behavior. And this, of course, includes assessing employees' perceptions, assessing the levels of trust in leadership. It talks about, or it refers also to about whether there are whistleblowing mechanisms in place and whether they are actually working and effective. And then whether there's an alignment between the formal and informal culture, which means between the stated values and the actual behavior. And then a very important part, and this is one of what the constructs of an ethical culture, is about accountability. The board must ensure that without fear and favor, everyone is held accountable when they transgress the organization's ethical standards.
Thank you. Liezl, I think my next question is really about on an individual basis now. Is it correct to say that individuals can exercise and develop ethical courage? Let's just say whether you're at a board meeting or whether you're at a committee meeting, is there room for directors to build ethical courage so that they can navigate dilemmas better?
So, ethical courage is the willingness to do what is right, despite personal, professional, financial, or reputational risks. And for directors, we know that directors need to have the ICRAFT characteristics according to King 5, but ethical courage isn't one of it in King 5. And ethical courage is not a personality trait. It is something that we develop, as you have quite rightly indicated. And it is a capability that one can develop, and it can strengthen over time through practice. It's really not easy. So they can build ethical courage by clarifying their values and principles before a crisis in the organization arises. Now, it is easier to make difficult decisions when one knows already what you stand for, because then one can reflect on that when there are difficult decisions. It is also about creating a culture on the board of constructive challenge, where difficult questions are welcomed in the board meeting rather than discouraged. Thirdly, it's about practicing the ethical deliberation through scenario discussions and case studies. And I also always say that ethics should be on the agenda of the governing body, because after a meeting, they should reflect on whether decisions have been taken ethically. And if not, the directors must really question it. They have to discuss from a scenario point of view so that they can work through complex ethical dilemmas. It is also about encouraging diversity and diverse perspectives in the board meetings, to ensure that there's not so much pressure to conform, because that's one of the reasons why people don't really have a dissenting view during board meetings, because they feel that pressure to conform. And then I think another, and maybe a last one to mention, is for ethical courage to develop over time, is for others to support those people who raise concerns, and thereby they reinforce the courage, and that is then valued and protected.
Liezl, let's say there is an ethical breakdown. A board decision was believed to be unethical by its stakeholders. How do organizations and boards actually recover from something like this?
It is not an easy thing to recover. It is often more difficult for us than preventing an ethical failure. So, because once your stakeholders perceive that a board has acted unethically, the issue is no longer only about the decision itself. It becomes a matter of trust. And we must remember, organizations do not trade in money, they trade in trust, credibility and legitimacy, and then of course accountability. So, and this is what we most often see doesn't happen, but the speed and sincerity of the response often determine whether confidence can be restored. So what should boards do? The first step would be to recognize that stakeholders' concerns are legitimate and it deserves attention. Defensive responses, which we see, denial so often, or attempts to minimize the concerns often deepen the crisis. So what should the boards ask? They should ask, what happened? Why are the stakeholders concerned? And what values and expectations do stakeholders believe were compromised? And then Again, the next thing is, before corrective action can be taken, the board must ensure that the matter is thoroughly and independently investigated and assessed. Okay, so that could entail internal review, external advice, and then that consultation with stakeholders. We should not forget our external and internal stakeholders. And one thing that boards don't always do is to accept accountability. It is one of the biggest mistakes that organizations make in focusing exclusively on the legal liability while neglecting the ethical accountability. Boards should communicate transparently, because trust is rebuilt through openness. Now, they should communicate what has been happening in the organizations. They should obtain information about the ethical culture, namely, which is then indicated through, for example, the whistleblowing reports that they have received, the ethical culture assessments that they have done, and the ethics risks that they have identified through this whole process. And lastly, they must reflect on their decisions afterwards and note the lessons that they have learned.
What gives you hope when it comes to ethical leadership in South Africa?
One would think that there's not a lot of hope, but there's always hope. So despite the many governance failures and ethical challenges that have dominated our headlines over the years, there are still several reasons for optimism that I truly believe in. Firstly, there is a growing recognition that ethics is not a soft issue, but a strategic imperative. Increasingly, boards and executives, regulators, and stakeholders understand the long-term sustainability depends on trust, integrity, and responsible leadership. And secondly, Vas, South Africa has developed a globally respected governance framework through King 5, which places ethical and effective leadership right at the center of governance. And this provides organizations with a strong foundation for governing ethics and ensuring ethical organizational cultures. Thirdly, and this is one that we forget so often, is that there are many, many examples of courageous leadership across the public, private, and civil society sectors. Ethical leadership may not always make headlines because it doesn't sell, but everyday individuals choose integrity over convenience, transparency over secrecy, and accountability over self-interest. And another matter that really gives me hope is that there's a growing willingness of employees and stakeholders to speak up about wrongdoing, even though they face significant challenges, and we read about that in the newspapers. But the fact that people continue to raise concerns demonstrate a commitment, in my opinion, to accountability and justice. And then finally, Vas, my hope lies in the fact that ethical leadership is no longer viewed as optional. More and more leaders are, in fact, recognizing that in a world characterized by disruption, uncertainty, and complexity, ethics is not a constraint on success. Ethics is a prerequisite for sustainable success.
Thank you, Liezl, for that very insightful answer to that question. I found this chat to be very inspiring, actually. And my biggest takeaway here is that, and what stood out for me was really about the accountability, the transparency, and also the ethical courage that we as individuals take on. And we have to exercise that ethical courage at board level, director level, and in our everyday lives, in fact. So thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, Vas. It was a lovely discussion.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation with Dr. Liezl Groenewald. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our channel to receive alerts about future conversations. If you would like to equip yourself with the tools and knowledge to navigate ethics, head to our website at www.iodsa.co.za and visit our training page to explore the range of ethics courses available.